Hello and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. So after almost a year's break, we're delighted to be back for some more episodes. So to kick things off today, I'm talking with Helen Bledsoe, a flutist who wears many hats, including soloist, ensemble player, teacher, improviser, author, and creator of experimental electronic works. She is a core member of the renowned ensemble Musique Fabrique. She teaches across the world. She's currently a guest professor at the Academy of Music in Riga and guest faculty for the Lucerne Festival Academy. And she's also an external artist consultant in AI-based creative and performance practices for the research team Creaci at the Royal Conservatory of Antwerp. So today we shall be learning more about her various practices and also how she has recently been using some of the FluCoMa tools in her work. So Helen, hello, and thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jakob. Over the years, I've found these podcasts to be really informative and inspiring, so I'm honored to take part.
Right, welcome. We're really happy to have you. So to begin, perhaps you could explain to us how you got into the world of music and also perhaps into the electronic and digital side of things.
Sure. Well, my early life was a bit chaotic, and there was a time when I was living with a dear aunt of mine who was a painter and who had actually built her own harpsichord from a kit that she had ordered. And so it was she who taught me how to read music when I was 7 years old. And around age 9, I picked up the flute as part of the wind band program in school. As you can hear, I'm American, so that's what we had. And since I changed schools quite often, we didn't have music private lessons. My engagement with music was actually quite sporadic. But when I was 14, I heard about a local band director who had opened a private music school. And I went along with my band geek friends to check him out. And he was the first and really the only person who ever said to me, "You can do anything you set your mind to, and you can achieve anything." And since I'm a naive, kind of literal-minded person, I actually believed him. And so I practiced really hard. And I actually won an audition in a local orchestra the next year when I was only 15. And I went on to study at various state schools in the United States, and then I ended up at the conservatory in Amsterdam. And directly after my studies, I met Musique Fabrique in Darmstadt. That was in 1996, and I've been with him ever since. But that was all way back last century. Let's fast forward a little bit to 2016. When I first encountered Guy Maddin's films, the director from Canada. And this was the time of his really hot project called Séance, which was an interactive internet film project, which I found really fascinating. And his feature film, The Forbidden Room, which incorporated a lot of these melting style digital visual graphics, which I found very inspiring because they use a lot of techniques, I think, that are also involved with digital signal processing. I didn't even know what digital signal processing was at the time, but it turns out that way. And I also have to mention that around that time, before the pandemic and before the war with Ukraine, I spent a lot of time in Russia, for family reasons. And also because I had a musical partner there, Alexei Lapin, who was a pianist and sound engineer. And he invited me to take part in loads of free jazz concerts and many recordings. So I was very active there as that kind of player. And it was there, actually, in St. Petersburg, that I did all my really creative work, all the improvising and experimenting. But around the summer of 2017, things started to change. I mean, they already really sucked in Russia, and I could feel the civilization, just crumbling around me. And I was a bit obsessed with the decay of everything. And at the same time, my musical partner, Alexei, he burned out. He dropped music and he went to live in a cabin near the Finnish border in the woods. So there was this huge creative hole in my life, and also a massive motivation to express all the horror I was witnessing. And flute playing just couldn't really fill the bill. So that's where my interest in electronics came in, starting with DAWs like GarageBand, Mixcraft, and free synthesizers like Caustic and Surge. And Guy Madden, before, had been very kind, and he gave me access to some of the outtakes that he'd done and studies that he'd done for The Forbidden Room so that I could play around with them and make music with them. That was the start of it.
Hmm. That's really interesting to hear you about sort of talking about decay and expressing the horrors and things that you may have witnessed around you. So is that quite a recurrent theme in your approach to composition more than interpretation, or is that something that feeds into all aspects of your work?
I'm sure it feeds into all aspects of my work. I'm not an overtly political artist. I think I can't be, because I think my emotions are too close to the surface. And in some ways, there's a quote by Harry Partch, which I'll read. It says, and he says, "Nothing can be more futile or downright idiotic than to express this age or one's age." And he says the prime obligation of the artist is to transcend his age or her age, and therefore to show it in terms of eternal mysteries. And what this age needs more than anything else is an effective antidote. And I have two opinions at the same time. I hope I'm allowed to think two things at the same time. In one sense, I think it's a bit pretentious. On the other sense, I completely agree with him, somehow personally. So, yeah, it's a hard question to answer, how and exactly how things influence me, but I know that they're there. I can't deny it.
Hmm. That's great. Well, maybe towards the end we'll get more into sort of those general approaches to composition, but perhaps to start things off more kind of practically. So as you explained, you play your main instrument. I would allow myself to say is the flute.
Yes.
So you're a soloist and an ensemble player. I wonder if you could talk about the kind of music you interpret when you're playing the flute, and your approaches to collaboration and working with other people. So, be it through the interpretation of a composer's music, or also through playing with other musicians.
Well, yes. Well, as a soloist, I would say, and an ensemble player, I take my approach or my to collaboration. I take my cue usually from the composer, because some composers are extremely detailed and they'll take lots of notes, and others are more hands off. You know, they'll accept a commission, and then with very little back and forth, they'll deliver the piece. I mean, I've worked on premieres by Stockhausen, who I mean is living in Cologne. He's our local composer and still is. We premiered his with Musikfabrik his Rotary Quintet for winds, and I've collaborated on solo works with Georges Epergis and Rebecca Saunders, and they all have really different approaches, and always are really fine with me. But I like to imagine. I imagine my ideal collaboration would be something like Luigi Nono and Roberto Fabriciani had, you know, where you spend days in an electronic studio only experimenting with no agenda, but taking notes and letting the instrument and the sounds guide the creative process. But that's a luxury we don't often have, and certainly didn't have during the pandemic. So I've never experienced it yet. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question?
Yes, certainly. And yeah, I think that idea of letting instruments and sounds guiding the creative process is something that's really interesting. And and so, well, as you say, you've also began started doing lots of compositional work. Is that something that drives your approach to composition? That idea of letting the instrument and the sounds the sounds drive the composition and these experiments?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Um, Actually, I had a very free idea before I even decided that I really wanted to compose, and that was to have the idea to create soundtracks for players that they could improvise along with. Um, sounds based on their own instrument or on something completely abstract that would inspire them, to create. But that idea didn't really take off because in the end, I think players like stuff to practice, and experienced improvisers need more freedom than just a soundtrack. And while I don't think every piece should be set in a traditional score, I'm finding that through myself creating scores, I'm learning a lot about timing and form and how to communicate information graphically, which I think is really interesting because there are similarities to creating graphical user interfaces for software devices. Traditions like it's a dial button and conventions where you need to be precise, but you also need to inspire and sort of factor in a little bit of fun in the process. And also because there are so many cool instrumental sounds. But I think for people to really appreciate them, they need a context and a frame. For other people to appreciate them, not for me, I can appreciate them, but for other people. And that's kind of the share factor. That sort of share factor also got me from this thing just wanting to create cool sounds and letting the instrument speak for itself. There's the share factor that sort of pushed me into creating scores, because I had no trouble in the acousmatic world. You can just be me alone with my eyes closed in digital sounds. But sharing the process is special. And so far, every attempt that I made to actually put a work into a score has been artistically satisfying. Really hard work, but worth it.
Yeah. And I'd like to hear about how you started beginning to work with computers. So you were talking about working with resources that were given to you by Guy Madden. Were they visual?
Yes.
Yeah. So was your into the kind of digital world via wanting to manipulate visual content? What kind of experiments did you do with those resources, and how did it lead to sort of to DSP and audio processing?
Well, I wasn't so much. I didn't feel I had the abilities to manipulate the visual material. So my idea was more to sonify the visual processes. If you've seen parts of The Forbidden Room or his outtakes, which are called ecto loops, you have a lot of sort of facial visualizations that dissolve and decay. And a big, also this project for him was a big breakthrough in that he started working with colors, where before a lot of his work had been in black and white. So the use of color and the use of gradually moving visual things, I had more of the interest in sonifying that kind of thing and evoking that to use, to become sound.
Yeah. And so your experiments with DSP are quite recent then. I'm always curious about how you approached learning this quite complicated skill set. Was it through lots of trial and error? Did you attend classes on it? And I think it can be useful for people listening who perhaps wanting to get into this kind of thing, but perhaps not knowing where to begin. How did you approach learning these skills?
I did not have any formal training in it. I started, as I mentioned, with GarageBand, and then I ditched Apple things. And I heard a lot. I had a colleague, Melvin Poor, who was our tuba player and retired recently, who worked a lot with Max. And so I knew a little bit about Max from him. And through Max, I learned about Ableton. And it was actually, though, through experimenting with Ableton, I took the plunge and I purchased Ableton. And it's through Ableton that I got into Max, because they have so many wonderful Max for Live devices, and I would open them up and see what's what. And then I started getting into tinkering with my own. And to do that, mostly I used online learning platforms like Cadence, which has out of Stanford. And then later for like Python and PyTorch, which I only dabbled into, I think I did Udemy, this platform to learn. And I also had a book about neural networks, programming in Python that I just worked through. I have to look up the name of that. I've forgotten it already. But yes, online platforms like Music Hackspace has been very helpful. I've profited a lot from not only from their classes, but from their meetups, which I've attended and even presented on. So it's a very nice community. And
Yeah.
it was actually through Music Hackspace and Umut Eldom, who initiates a lot of their work, that I came to be on this, an external part of this research project in Antwerp.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're talking about the Max for Live devices there. So it's true that the various things, various experiments and resources that you publish in terms of software online, so this is talking about some of the FluCoMa related experiments that we'll talk about in just a moment, but also your collection of AZ devices. They're often in the form of Max for Live devices. I just wonder what it is about this approach that entices you, and perhaps if you could talk about the role of Ableton as an interface in your work more globally, and also, yeah, perhaps thinking back to you were talking about graphical user interfaces as means for provoking inspiration and conveying perhaps musical thought and things like that.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, for me, I think DAWs as a user interface for somebody who's just learning production are a lot easier to deal with than just pure max patches, because they have their tracks and they have your sends and then your mixer. So how can I say this? So it's just sort of a familiar ground with me working in Ableton. And so when I got into Max, I also then, by extension, got into Gen a little bit. Actually, not a little bit. It's been kind of a rabbit hole for me, because I read Generating Sound and Organizing Time by Graham Wakefield and Gregory Taylor. And so every time I come across a cool idea in Gen or in Max, I think of using it in Ableton, because I'm thinking in the back of my head, how can I apply this process to a live performance? Or specifically, how can I play this on flute or on whatever at the same time? And Ableton is still where I'm most comfortable, but as a kind of by the way, is my next project, which is a presentation at the Convergence conference in Antwerp. I'm going to be not using Ableton. And that's because there is a drawback of Ableton, and that is there's single threading on single tracks, which means running heavy processing on single tracks can run into CPU spikes and issues. So, I mean, for example, I'll be running the in tilde project, which object, which we can talk about maybe later. Loads of FluCoMa descriptors and Rodrigo Constanza's corpus player and concatenator, and a lot of sort of like roll your own digital synthesizers. So for that, I'm getting away from Ableton, but this doesn't mean that I'm going to stop using it or stop developing these devices, these AZ devices or AZ devices. Actually, some of them are going to be coming out in the Isotonic Studios shop, and they'll contain some of the FluCoMa tools that are needed for onset detection and loudness descriptors. And also, I made my first noise EP, which I called Fracas, and using analog Moog synthesizers, digital and neural synthesis. And all of that was produced on Ableton. So, I mean, Ableton as as an all-around thing which can produce pop music, classical contemporary music, and integrate Max is just it's been wonderful for me.
Mm. And when you approach designing the interface to these devices, when you talk about GUIs being able to inspire, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, how that kind of translates into the design of some of your devices.
Well, I mean, I'm not such a great designer, so I don't go hog wild with this kind of thing. I've seen some of these devices. I think it's called the Comasi, the synthesizer, where it's beautiful. It's so beautiful, but you really, unless you've worked with synthesizers a lot and you know that there's a carrier and a modulator and an index and somewhere, faders and filters, and you have no idea what it is, but it looks beautiful. So I try to make a balance between being the prosaic, practical things and also the design. And I weigh heavily on the prosaic, just because I'm not a visual artist myself. And because some things I look at, I was going through one of my devices yesterday, and I know there's something wrong with it, with the visual interface, and I couldn't figure out why. It just took me the longest time to figure out why. So it's a slow process for me to get things to work and look nice. But then I really do appreciate the factor that you need to be inspired to work at these. Otherwise, because if you look on the repository of Max for Live devices, there are over 5,000 of them. And, there are over 500 LFOs anyway. So who needs to look at mine? These I have no answers to this kind of thing. It's just things that I think about, and I try to work in. But I don't do funny graphics of extras with pictures or custom dials or things like that. Also because I feel like people who work in Ableton a lot want to be able to use their theme, their skin, and some people even design their own, and they probably want their devices to reflect that. So I leave a lot of things at the default. Whatever their skin is, it's going to show up on my device.
Yeah. And it's true that, being able to configure one's own working environment, whether it's simply by using things like themes and skins in Ableton, or building your own devices from scratch and configuring the way they look, it's an important part of the process as well, because you're configuring the environment that you're going to be creating music in. And and there are lots of different approaches to it. You're talking about Rodrigo Constanzo, who always has some of the most beautiful patching I've ever seen, very organized, very straight line stuff. And then you'll have, we were talking with John Bowers on the podcast on one of the previous episodes, who exclusively uses pure data and really goes for that kind of raw wires and kind of messy look, and sort of steers away from the kind of polish that Max can offer. But but it's as a musicologist, it's really interesting for me to see how musicians configure their environments and the ways that they present their tools to themselves.
I just wanted to say, I think there's a parallel to this in analog instrument building. I mean, having worked with Harry Partch's music a lot, him and the design of his own instruments to speak their own things, there has to be a sort of some kind of aesthetic element. I mean, otherwise, and flutes, are made of silver or gold or something. There has to be some, not only the acoustic desire, but the desire to engage with him and interact with him. But yeah, that's all I want to say.
No, definitely, yeah. So I'd love to talk about some of the things that you've been doing with the FluCoMa toolkit. So you mentioned in passing some of the objects that you've been using. So I know that you've been following the project for a while, and that you're also active on the forum, which is always great to see. So I mean, we probably won't have time to go over everything, but one of the projects that I seen you've been working on, which I found quite interesting, was using the MLP classifier. So I wonder if you could talk about how you've been using it, and what drew you to using neural networks and something like classification for your musicking.
Sure, yeah. Well, I was never a gear type of person, and my small budget mostly goes into maintaining flute-related stuff for my job. So, I mean, on top of that, my hands are busy when I'm playing, and coordinating foot pedals is not a talent or skill that I ever developed. So neural networks classifiers and descriptors are, the perfect answer for sending audio to interesting places. And the MLP classifier I've used as a Max for Live device works really great in Ableton because I could train it on, say, 3 different sounds and assign different tracks with different FX change to each of those sounds. And of course, some of the sounds will fall into the cracks, but with, I think, a judicious use of gating and ramping, you can have happy accidents. And my problem is that I can never decide which is better, the 13 MFCCs or the 32 mel bands. So I think if I ever create a shareable live device, I'll probably have the option to switch between the two.
Mm.
So,
It's interesting to hear so that your practice as a flutist steered informs the way that you're configuring your tools, and it's that limitation that your hands are busy to be able to do things. So that's what drove you to using a tool like that.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. You've also been using the sign feature object in conjunction with onset detection, I believe. So what were your intentions with that, and how are things panned out?
Sure, yeah. I had a good conversation with PA about this. My initial intentions to use this came from my work with Harry Partch's instruments, particularly his glass gongs, which are called the cloud chamber bowls. They have really beautiful, irregular, inharmonic spectra. For Partch's work, Delusion of the Fury, which Musikfabrik did in 2013, we needed 14 of these gongs arranged in ascending order. And our colleagues and I had arguments about which bowl sounded higher, because depending on an individual's ear, they would pick out a different partial. So, I mean, that was great fun. So, sign feature plays a role in a concept piece that I've developed, but I haven't performed this or realized it yet. The idea is to take a number of these gongs, or actually it could be any percussion instrument with interesting non-harmonic partials, and through sign feature, get those partials and pick the good ones. This would be done before because it's not real-time stuff, and then put them into a buffer. And the one thing I like about sign feature is that you can have the partials listed according to frequency or amplitude. And I find that the frequency listing from low to high is better for the higher gongs, the higher pitched gongs, and the amplitude listing is more useful for the lower gongs. And I also like the fact that you can have large FFT settings, which are good for detecting these low frequencies. And so once you have all these frequencies in a buffer, you can do the live real-time things. So along with the real, performing on the gongs, each frequency from a particular gong, which has been saved in the buffer, can be sent either to individual oscillators that are playing in the background or to live players, such as string players. And that sort of would provide then an ethereal glass-like backdrop. And there would be random processes that choose these frequencies and their dynamic envelopes. And then to change the group of frequencies, this is where the onset detection comes in to play. There are several ways. I mean, you could either trigger the change manually, or you could set up the classifier, which has been trained on these gongs. And that will then trigger the correct frequencies that should be performed in the background. But you can't always have this classifier going because you don't want it triggering the whole time, but you turn it on and off. So one of the gongs it's been trained on, like I said, will send the frequencies out to give it that glassy feel. And this sort of led me to another interesting research area. Which frequencies, how many are needed to where you really get a feel for the material that you're trying to evoke, whether it's glass or metal. And it's just an idea for a future research project. I have no insights or words of wisdom about that yet. And I didn't find much research done on it either, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that does sound really interesting. Yeah. It's interesting hearing you talk about the initial intentions of that piece, and you talk about how different human listeners weren't perhaps classifying things in the same way. And I suppose that for me brings up the question of the differences between human listening and machine listening, human perception and machine perception. Um, I wonder if that's something that you think about, and perhaps how, if there's a relationship between those two different approaches to the perception of what's happening in your work, and how you kind of tackle the idea of machine perception and what it's for in your practice.
I think the human ear is, at this point in time, is a much more, as a finer instrument than almost any machine listening thing out there. I mean, the machine can, of course, spit out the actual frequencies that they hear. But I mean, as a long-time flute player, I can tell you that there have been tests on metals, whether the sound of a silver flute is different from a gold flute, and the machines won't tell you much, but the players can tell you everything. They'll hear the difference. And I mean, in my own practice, what I'm asking the algorithms to hear or the machines to listen for is rather actually quite crude stuff. It's either a list of numbers to spit out, or I ask it for it to make a decision when it detects that something's happening, and that's good enough for my purposes. So that relationship you asked about the relationship, and I think that's a good relationship at the moment. If it just sort of, in a way, does the background heavy lifting, and then the human element takes care of the rest of it, and then the audience will be taking care of something else. They'll be perceiving it, the frequencies and things in their own brains, and come up with their own visions and experiences.
Yeah. So staying I suppose, in the kind of timbral and spectral world, another technique that you've been exploring recently, which you mentioned earlier, in fact, not with the FluCoMa tools, but using the acids team double N object, using the rave model, is timbre transfer. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk about this technique, and what role does something like timbre transfer play in your work?
Yes, I've always found it. I mean, I love the traditional effects of delay and feedback, especially, but this timbre transfer is something completely different. As far as rave is concerned, I've trained several models on its first version, mostly bad ones, but they can be used in interesting sound design ways, as I said, as different ways of producing effects. I've made several loopophone models, and some of them from my own flute sounds, and some on just random material. And like I said, this always plays in the role is normally for sound design and not so much real-time processing, because at the moment the NN object, which then it reads the tensor files that the rave models produce, it will always have a latency of up to 40 milliseconds, at least the models that I've been trained on. And that's the best it can do at the time. But although I say that, even for live performance, that can be interesting, especially if you combine it with Rodrigo Constanzo's SP tools, which rely, of course, on FluCoMa, so have next to zero latency. Then you can have things that play with you and also seem to be playing off of you at the same time. Like I say, there are several interesting developments in the VST and AU world from companies like Neutone and Datamind. I haven't tried Datamind's combobulator, which uses models and for timbre transfer, but they warn that there's like it can be up to 900 millisecond latency. Neutone, their FX and Morpho, which is still in the beta stage, have worked a way to reduce these latency issues for their models, at least the ones I've tried. And they're more friendly on the CPU than the NN tilde object. because I think they're converting the existing PyTorch models in a way to make them executable in a VST plugin. And what's cool about the Neutone FX is you can load your own rate models, but you have to convert them using their software development kit. So I think this is all very exciting, but I also should say that this kind of timbre transfer, using these trained AI models to place something else with something else, is something that I personally want to do, not because I want my sound to be replaced by an exact model, because I think all of these models sound strange. They have their own kind of sound and own kind of vibe that departs from the originals. And there are artifacts in the sound. To me, it can sort of sound like a sewing machine or something robotic and mechanic. But this is what I like to work with. So it's, you listen to it and you don't think, oh, that's a Helen flute sound. No, you think, what the hell is that? And that's more of what I'm going for. And the funny thing is that from a video I saw from a developers conference, I watched the guys at Neutone. I think it's not Neutone, I'm saying it in German, Neutone. They mentioned this, that the models of AI have a particular sound these days. And here I'm imagining a future where we try to create artifacts from vinyl and cassettes. And I imagine future artists may take the trouble to recreate the sounds of early AI models. So that's kind of where I am with this transfer thing, playing rhythms off each other and then creating sounds like, what the hell is that?
Mm. Yeah, no, I've never thought about, so you've got things like isotopes, VST for adding, giving a vinyl effect and correcting like that, and perhaps in 20 years people will be looking to recreate the artifacts of early neural networks and things like that. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But yeah, no, it's interesting to hear. So, because it's not a generative neural network in the sense of something like, OpenAI's Sona, or what's the video model called? It is Sona, I believe, or Sora. Anyway, I'll put that in.
Not in my usage. There is usage that can do that. You can train the RAID models to do that and be generative, but I haven't used that yet.
Yeah. But it is interesting. Yeah, the question of the artifact and the fact that the results and things are never going to be perfect, and that they do have this specific aura to them. It's really interesting, and it's something that seems to motivate a lot of artists when using these tools. I suppose it could kind of join those ideas of decay that you were talking about earlier, and kind of this imperfect image, and it's interesting. But so you're talking about using that kind of tool to explore the kind of sonic materiality, perhaps, of the flute, and you're talking about training loopophone models, and over your career as a composer, you've written pieces for flutes, for loopophones, for contrabass flute, for alto flute, for bass flute, for piccolos, and also for vocals. I wonder, perhaps in a more kind of broader sense, if you'd want to talk about woodwind instruments and your relationship with them as a musician. So as a flutist, but also as someone who explores their sound more generally as a composer, if there are differences between those two stances.
Okay. Well, first I should say that very few of these works have written scores. But from a sound design point of view, I mean, woodwinds are my closest source. I mean, oboist Peter Viel, who's my closest colleague in Musikfabrik, I've been sitting next to him for over 25 years. He's been extremely supportive of all of my creative efforts, and he loves the loopophone. So that's kind of how I got into that. I wrote a graphic score called Kisa for him, which you can see his performance or even read the rolling score on YouTube. He also plays the bass koto. So I have a work called Horo Horo To, which does have a written score. and uses the classifier and also the buff NMF object to do spectral separation. In this piece, he plays the oboe as well as the koto. But to get back to my relationship with woodwinds, I think it is related to the use of their the breath and the voice, and how you can combine their sounds with the breath and with the voice. Have this mix of traditional sounds, and it's also the fact that woodwinds can produce really amazing extended techniques, such as multiphonics and percussive effects. And I think for this reason, for the longest time, I never felt the need to get into electronics to enhance my flute sound. Because flutist Robert Dick, who was my mentor for many years, he told me, you don't need electronics to enhance your sound. The flute's capable of doing cool stuff without this, which I think was perhaps good advice at the time, but because I really explored in the flute sound and only later came to the electronics. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Go into the spectral thing of different woodwinds, but that's all. I find it interesting, but I am getting more into string instruments. My big project this year is a written piece, a proper piece with a score for tromba marina and electronics, and that's going to be premiered here in Cologne in June. Writing for violinist Sarah Kubarsi.
Well, we'll look forward to that, definitely, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, talking about some of the extended techniques for woodwinds and things like multiphonics and circular breathing and those kind of things. Yeah, they're very complex instruments. One thing that I found quite interesting and quite amusing as well on your website was that you had a section called Advice for Composers, where you offer some resources for composers wishing to work with flutes and perhaps wanting to use those kinds of extended techniques. And it made me wonder about perhaps some of the experiences that you may have had that may have led you to needing to write these resources, and perhaps what are some of the difficulties that composers may have when looking to write music for these instruments?
Sure. At Musikfabrik, we take part in a lot of, what do you call them, collaborations with the different conservatories, local and also abroad, working with student composers and also young professional composers. So I find myself, saying a lot of the same things over and over, as far as advice for writing for flute and general notation. And it's the thing, I always try to preface my advice with the statement that it applies normally to ensemble writing. And if you are writing flute music for a solo player or a certain player, that you should ignore everything I say and take the advice of the player you're working with. I mean, I think there are good books that you can find on writing for flute, but I'm appalled by the paywall of some of these sources. And, although I recognize the need for educators to earn a living and for publishers to keep afloat, and as someone who never had much money as a student, I feel really the need to put the information out there and make it available. And sometimes I think that it's probably too much. I think for some students, it's probably too much information. I was even told by one composition student that if they looked at my blog, it would stifle their creativity, So it takes all kinds, but at least the information is there and it's free for those who want it,
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's very useful, and yeah, I'd be hard pressed to understand to having a deeper understanding about how a musical instrument works could suppress someone's creativity. But maybe there is an instrument for that. Who knows? Cool. Maybe just a couple of broader questions to close things off. We talked about at the beginning, so some experiments where you're working with visual content in your composition and looking to sonify the content of that you were working with. Um, uh, another kind of extra musical, using quotation marks, content that you've used as inspiration for composition is poetry. You've done a few adaptations of poetry into music. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about that process, how you go into reading of a poem, and how you translate poetry into musical gestures in your practice.
Okay. Well, I really only get poetry if it's put or set to music. And sometimes if I find myself reading it aloud, depending on its language, it has a melody. There's something musical in it inherently. And also, what I love about poetry, it gives you a ready-made structure. So I have to think, though, I think my original inspiration for doing this was performing Pierrot Lunaire, which I first did as a student. And I loved the idea of Sprechstimme. Even though I've had some decent vocal training, I'm still not really a good singer. I performed Harry Partch's Ring Around the Moon, which the first few performances really sucked, but then I got better. But it's still something that I never wanted to pursue, this kind of singing, because it just takes so much work. So doing small scale things like poetry readings with electronics that I can manage, and it's really fun, and it seems like a kind of safe space. How particularly I do it, I read it over and over again. I do some pitch following to my voice to have either an instrument following my pitch. I add rhythmic things when I think there's a kind of rhythm that goes with it. They offer many sound design possibilities. One I've done with just completely using the foot joint, buzzing into the foot joint of a flute that sounds like little demons. I did that with one of the Anne Sexton poems, which talks about devils and demons. So I don't know, but I'm going into this is something I'd like to pursue, but not, like I said, not being a vocalist performer myself. I'm going to team up this year with a performer from Barcelona. So she'll be choosing the text, probably in Catalan, I hope, and I'll be doing the electronics, and we'll see what comes of that.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about structure, because something that so I did my PhD at Huddersfield, where I was one of the only musicologists. It was mainly composers and musicians that were at Huddersfield. And one aspect that I found that young composers seemed to struggle with the most was ideas of structure and macroscopic structure and things. And today, although I mean it's kind of by design of the format of this podcast, we've been talking about techniques and instruments and things. So we've been talking a lot about sound design. But yeah, I wonder, is kind of macroscopic structure something that you've struggled with? Is it other than apart from poetry? How do you approach the structure of a piece, and perhaps maybe that could lead into how you kind of approach structure when you're improvising as well. Yeah, I wonder if you could unpack that the idea of structure in your work.
Structure is something I struggle with. It's one of the overarching compositional areas that I find the most challenging. I was lucky to do one of my first sound design works with a choreographer, which really helped me to structure. That was something that premiered back in 2020 during the pandemic. And to be brutally honest, my best indicator of structure is what happens is I work on a piece, and then I play it for somebody else. and someone who's absolutely brutally honest and will tell me that, this part doesn't make sense. And for me, that's my husband. He's an incredible support, and he's Russian, so he's straightforward. Absolutely. I mean, I had to laugh. Like, one of the first times I met him, he sat around with his friends drinking tea and complaining about how wishy-washy the Germans are. So that gives you an idea. And this is something that, but whether it's a partner, you have somebody you trust, or another pair of ears, a professor or a mentor. I find myself relying on that a lot for my ideas of structure, because this is, maybe when I have more experience, I'll struggle with this less. But it's something, you can fall so into something that you can fall in love with your own sounds, or fall in love with your own structures, and they make perfect sense to you, but absolutely none to anybody else, I've also, read and seen videos and inspirational talks by people who plan things out before they even start working on a piece. And I think it's a very valid way of doing things. But since I'm so hands-on with my sound, and I only become inspired when I hear something, or when I see a tool that inspires me to work, since my inspiration comes from that end, I think the structure is something that comes last. Maybe it shouldn't. I don't know.
Oh yeah, well, there's no right or wrong answer, I should imagine.
And I remember working with Earl Brown. This is back in 2001. He came to work with us at Ensemble Musikfabrik. We did an academy with him. And he actually said, everything has a form. And any piece of art has a form. So, I mean, I could comfort myself with that thought, and then I could take Frank Zappa's advice, as long as it has a frame around it, it has a form. I mean, all art should have a frame around it. Otherwise, what's that shit on the wall? So.
Cool. So maybe just as one final question. So we've been talking about lots of different machine learning and artificial intelligence driven techniques, a field that's obviously developing rapidly, notably with things like all the work that's happening at OpenAI and things like that at the moment. But it's striking how you seem to be someone that seems to be so on top of these techniques, and is looking to really experiment with all the latest technologies and see how they can augment your work. I was just wondering, maybe to finish, if you could talk about how you see your relationship with technology developing in the coming years.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's so exciting. This is where I wish I were a better programmer. I can do a bit of Python, and I always joke that my knowledge of Python, if you were to compare it to like a spoken language, I would know enough how to get to the train station, and that's about it. I could find my way there. But I have the feeling that by the time I get good at something like that things will have already moved on. And so, I mean, it's also why I've been considering getting into VST development. But the challenge for me is not only learning, C++, but the whole building environment, with Visual Studio and Juice and all that. And I think Max's Rainbow is something really good that can sort of smooth the way. But I think I would still need the basic of those programs if I wanted to make anything shareable of quality. And also getting into programming neural audio processes for VST is really difficult from what I understand from the developers. Because VST and AU were not originally developed with neural audio in mind, but it's the most universal format that we have at the moment. So again, I'm not sure whether to invest the time to develop VSTs when there may be something new on the horizon that's going to replace it. And I also have the feeling that people's interest in me is not for my coding abilities, but for my musicianship and performance. So I think whatever direction I take, I can't let that aspect of myself fall by the wayside.
Yeah. And so, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but when you talk about learning C++ rather than using something like Rainbow, is that purely on a performance-based side of things? Do you see yourself wanting to explore more heavier processing techniques, or yeah, do you feel that yeah the kind of path that you're going down, you have this want or this need to explore some more and more complex techniques that require.
I think it's for the practical reason that, like even some of the Max devices I'm developing, which I have in mind for use for myself or for others with whom I work, they take up too much CPU if you put them on a single track in Ableton. So if you can if you can compile them, build them, make them into a VST, then they'll be less CPU intensive. So
Yeah,
a lot of that is just practical because what I'm wanting to do is becoming a little bit more and more CPU intensive.
yeah. Okay, cool. Well, Helen, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting.
Thanks.
I'm sure people will be there's going to be a whole list of things on the FluCoMa Learn page that accompanies this podcast that people will be eager to going in and looking at. Yeah, it's been really great to hear about your work, and really impressive also to hear how in such a short amount of time you're playing with all these quite complicated techniques, and seeing how you're managing to do that in such a short amount of time. Because yeah, it's I'd say so. What, since 2020, more or less, that you've been
Well,
dabbling?
well, more 2017
Right.
probably, more
Okay.
like it.
Yeah.
But the max part of it, yeah,
Still.
I would say the max part of it's been since 2020. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we look forward to seeing your work as it progresses. So, as I said, people can find the FluCoMa Learn page for all the links about things that we've been discussing down in the description of this video on YouTube, or the description of the audio stream for this podcast. So, Helen, thank you so much. It
Thanks
was
for
a
having
pleasure
me.
having you.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. I shall speak to you again soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.